Royalty spent 3,000 years protecting the sacred bloodline by keeping it in the family, sometimes way too far in the family. What they built was a genetics experiment with crowns on. So, here are history's most inbred rulers, ranked from mildly awkward to a king who literally could not chew his own food. Quick number: 0.25 means your parents were siblings, and one man here sails right past it. So let us start easy. The royal disease. We are starting soft, with the woman who ran a fifth of the planet and accidentally poisoned the gene pool of half of Europe. Queen Victoria married her first cousin, Prince Albert, in 1840, which by royal standards is basically a rounding error. First cousins are the gateway drug of royal inbreeding. Everybody did it, nobody blinked, and Victoria and Albert were genuinely, annoyingly happy about it. The problem was not the cousin marriage itself. The problem was riding along in Victoria's DNA. She was a carrier of hemophilia, a condition where the blood does not clot properly, so a bruise that would heal on you or me could turn into a slow internal disaster. It is passed down on the X chromosome, which means mothers quietly carry it and sons get hit with it. And Victoria had a lot of children, 9 of them. Then she married those children into basically every royal house on the continent, because that was her whole retirement plan, being the grandmother of Europe. The strange thing is where it even came from. Hemophilia did not run in Victoria's family before her. The best guess of modern geneticists is that the mutation appeared fresh, spontaneously, right in Victoria herself, and one leading theory pins it on her father. He was 51 years old when she was born, and older fathers are statistically more likely to pass on brand new genetic mutation. So one aging duke may have accidentally handed his daughter a broken gene that would go on to haunt 4 royal houses. In 2009, scientists actually tested the bones of the murdered Russian royals and nailed down exactly which type it was, a specific fault in the gene that makes one of the proteins your blood needs to clot. A century of medical mystery, solved by digging up a mass grave. So she seeded the disease into the royal families of Britain, Germany, Russia, and Spain. Her son Leopold had it and died at 30 from a brain bleed after a minor fall. 2 of her daughters, Alice and Beatrice, were silent carriers who passed it right along, one line running into Russia, the other into Spain. Her grandson Friedrich, nicknamed Friddy, was 2 years old when he fell from a window, and a bleed that a normal toddler would have shrugged off killed him. This is the quiet horror of it. These were not dramatic deaths. They were small accidents that turned fatal because the blood would not cooperate. The most famous victim was Tsarevich Alexei of Russia, Victoria's great-grandson through her granddaughter Alex, and the sole male heir to the entire Russian Empire. The boy nearly died from internal bleeding over and over again, and no doctor could help him, because in that era there was no real treatment for hemophilia. So his desperate, terrified mother, the Empress, turned to a wandering, wild-eyed holy man named Rasputin, who somehow seemed able to calm the boy's crises when the doctors could not, possibly just by keeping everyone calm and away from the useless treatments of the day. That apparent miracle gave Rasputin an unbelievable grip on the imperial family, and through them, on the Russian government itself, and his scandalous influence at court became one of the things that shredded the monarchy's reputation in the years, right before the Russian Revolution swallowed the whole family, ending with them murdered in a cellar in 1918. Think about that chain of events. A recessive gene, handed down from a British queen, helped topple a 300-year Russian dynasty. That is the strange, invisible power of a single faulty line of DNA. But my favorite grim detail lives in Spain. Victoria's granddaughter Ina became Queen of Spain and carried the gene straight into the Spanish royal family. 2 of her sons had hemophilia, and both of them died the exact same way. Minor car accidents, Prince Gonzalo at 19, and Alfonso, the heir, at 31. 2 crashes that anyone else would have walked away from, and both princes bled out because their blood could not clot. Ina's husband, the king, blamed her tainted blood for ruining the dynasty and basically stopped speaking to her over it. Romantic guy. So Victoria earns the #1 spot on the lightest end. Just cousins, no monster jaws, no drooling kings. Just a disease that quietly followed the royal bloodline into car crashes and revolutions. It gets closer from here. Japan's backwards taboo. Now we go to ancient Japan, where the imperial family had a rule about inbreeding that is going to short-circuit your brain, because it is the exact opposite of what you would expect. In the West, if 2 people share one parent, we call them half-siblings, and we say absolutely not. In the ancient Japanese court, during the Kofun, Nara, and Heian periods, half-siblings who shared the same father but had different mothers could marry each other completely freely. That was fine, that was normal palace business. But siblings who shared the same mother? Hard no, strictly forbidden. Same womb, off limits. Take a second with that, because it is genuinely clever once you see the logic. Scholars think the reason was how elite families raised their kids. Children were brought up in the mother's household, not the father's. So if 2 royal kids had the same mother, they grew up together in the same home, they were raised as intimate siblings, and marrying them off felt wrong. But two kids of the same emperor with different mothers? They were raised in separate households, by separate families, and they might barely know each other. To the court, they were basically strangers who happened to share a dad. Fair game. The textbook example is Emperor Bidatsu, who ruled in the late 500s, and his wife, who later became Empress Suiko. They shared a father, Emperor Kinmei, but had different mothers, so their marriage was the socially perfect configuration. Suiko went on to become the first reigning empress in Japanese history, so this arrangement clearly did not slow her down. It got layered and fast. Emperor Tenmu, who ruled in the late 600s, married his own niece, who became Empress Jito. Several of his other wives were also his nieces, daughters of his own brother, and then their son turned around and married his aunt. So you had a court where an emperor's wife might also be his brother's daughter, and the next generation kept the wheel spinning. The court basically treated uncles marrying nieces as a Tuesday. Emperor Kinmei, a few generations earlier, reportedly married 3 of his nieces on top of a couple of sisters from a powerful noble clan, and fathered 3 future monarchs in the process. This was not a scandal anyone whispered about. It was the succession plan. The whole system was built to protect one thing: descent from the sun goddess Amaterasu, who the imperial family claimed as their divine ancestor. That heavenly bloodline passed down the father's side, so the paranoia was all about the paternal line staying pure, and the maternal side was where the real taboo lived. But here is the case that proves the rule, and it is dark and a little beautiful. Crown Prince Kanashi no Karu and Princess Karu no Oratsume were full siblings, same mother, same father. They fell in love anyway, and because they shared a mother, this was the one line the court would not cross. The prince's own retainers abandoned him over it. According to the ancient chronicle, the two lovers fled together and died in a double suicide, choosing to leave the world together rather than be forced apart. Keep in mind, this is semi-legendary history, so treat it as the story Japan told itself. But that is the point. Uncles marrying nieces was routine, and a poetic double suicide over 2 siblings was the cautionary tale. Japan drew its line in a place we never would have guessed, and here is why Japan never suffered a Habsburg-style collapse despite all this. The emperors kept a huge rotating cast of consorts and concubines, and legitimate imperial concubinage was legal right up until the 1920s. So even with all the cousin and niece marriages at the top, fresh outside bloodlines kept getting mixed in through the concubines, which quietly diluted the damage. Even the modern family kept the habit going. Emperor Hirohito married a distant cousin in 1924, and court advisors actually tried to block the engagement because there was hereditary color blindness lurking in her mother's family. Hirohito married her anyway. The bloodline was sacred, but apparently not sacred enough to skip the wedding over a little color blindness. 82 royal children. Let us talk about the king of Siam, who had so many children that his kids basically had to marry each other, and I mean that almost literally. King Mongkut, the Rama, the 4th of the king and I fame, fathered around 82 children with roughly 32 different consorts. 82. That is not a family, that is a small startup, and when you produce that many royal children, you create a very specific math problem for the next generation. Your heirs need to marry people of equal royal rank to keep the bloodline pure and the succession clean, and the only people of equal royal rank are, well, each other. So his son, King Chulalongkorn, the Rama, the 5th, married 4 of his own half-sisters, 4, all daughters of his father Mongkut, which made them Chulalongkorn's paternal half-sisters. Their names were Sunanda, Savangvadana, Salvaba, and Sukumala. And here is a spicy layer. 3 of those 4 sisters were full sisters to each other, all born to the same mother, but half-sisters to the king who married all of them. His household eventually held 9 queens, more than 140 concubines, and 76 children of his own. The man was running his father's business model. The half-sibling marriage was deliberate policy. Full-sibling marriage was avoided as a step too far, but half-siblings were considered acceptable for the highest royalty because it kept the crown legitimate and undiluted, and it worked out politically, at least. One of those half-sister queens, Sauvaba, became the first female regent in Siamese history, ruling the country while her husband traveled to Europe, and she was the mother of not 1 but 2 future kings. So the strategy delivered exactly what it was designed to: a tightly held, unquestionably royal line of succession. The genetics apparently held up better than the Habsburgs, probably because half-siblings share a lot less DNA than full siblings, and because the vast pool of consorts kept injecting new blood. The darkest chapter belongs to Queen Sunanda. In 1880, she was 19 years old and pregnant, traveling by royal boat with her 2-year-old daughter, when the boat capsized, and both of them drowned. Now here is where the story gets famous, and also where I have to be honest with you. The legend says an ancient law forbade any commoner from touching a royal on pain of death, so the guards and boatmen just stood there and watched their pregnant queen drown rather than break the taboo. It is a chilling image. It is also probably not exactly true. Chulalongkorn's own diary says people did jump in and try to pull her out. They just could not save her. so the version where everyone froze and watched is likely a myth. But the taboo itself was real enough that the king reformed the no-touching rules the very next year, and real enough that its shadow hung over the whole tragedy. He built her an enormous cremation monument and grieved hard. Even the softer true version is bleak. A teenage queen and her toddler gone because a boat tipped over. The Nubian pharaohs. Before we leave Africa, we need to give credit to the black pharaohs of Kush, from the kingdom that is now Sudan, because they looked at Egypt's ancient habit of marrying your sister and said, "We will take that tradition too, thank you." Around the 700s BC, the Kushite kings conquered Egypt and ruled it as the 25th dynasty. They were outsiders from the south, and one of the ways they proved they were legitimate pharaohs was by adopting the old Egyptian royal customs wholesale, including brother-sister marriage. If the real pharaohs did it, they would do it too, because there is no better way to prove you belong on a throne than to copy the throne's weirdest habit. The clearest verified case is Pharaoh Atlanersa, who ruled around 650 BC and married his sister Yetero. We know about her from her burial at Nuri, where archaeologists dug up hundreds of little funerary figurines with her name on them. There are claims that earlier Kushite founders married their sisters too, but historians are more cautious about those, so Atlanersa and Yetero are the solid, documented pairing. Now here is the genuinely clever part of the Kushite system, and it is a bit of royal genius. Kush ran on matrilineal succession, meaning the right to rule passed through the women, through the mother's line. So the royal women were not just accessories, they were the actual carriers of legitimacy. That is exactly why marrying a royal sister mattered so much. She was the one holding the keys to the kingdom, and they built a whole institution around controlling royal wombs, called the god's wife of Amun. This was a celibate royal princess who effectively ruled the holy city of Thebes as a priestess, and the office passed down not by birth, because she was not having children, but by adoption. So the Kushite kings would install their own daughters and sisters into this position, parking royal women in a sacred role where they held massive religious power and, crucially, could not produce rival heirs. Think about the cold logic of that. A king with a matrilineal system has a problem. His royal sisters and daughters are all potential mothers of rivals. The god's wife of Amun solved it by taking the most dangerous royal wombs and locking them into a holy, childless job for life. It was inbreeding and family planning fused into a single political weapon. We should be honest about the limits of the evidence here. The Kushite records are patchier than Egypt's, and some of the flashier claims, like the very first Kushite founders marrying their sisters, are questioned by modern Egyptologists, so Atlanersa and Yetero remain the rock-solid example. But the broad picture holds. The Egyptians invented the sister marriage. The Kushites conquered them, adopted it, and then turned it into a ruthless management strategy for an entire empire. The son's sister wife. Now we cross the ocean to South America and the Inca, where marrying your sister was not just allowed, it was practically the job description for being emperor. The Sapa Inca, the supreme ruler, was believed to be the living son of Inti, the sun god. He was a walking piece of the sun, and his principal queen, called the Koya, was supposed to mirror the moon goddess. So if you are the son of the sun, who could possibly be a worthy enough wife? Only someone with the same divine solar blood in her veins, which meant his own full sister. Marrying his sister kept the sun blood undiluted, so the next emperor would be doubly divine, sun on both sides. It goes all the way back to their origin myth, where the first Inca, Manco Capac, and his sister wife Mama Aklo were sent down by the sun to found the empire as a brother-sister couple. So the very first Inca was already the template. Emperor after emperor followed it, and if a sister Koya failed to produce a male heir, the emperor would simply marry a second sister, and if needed a third, working through the family until the divine bloodline delivered. Now, the Inca did not fall apart from birth defects. Their downfall was more of a political horror show. When the great emperor Huayna Capac died suddenly around 1527, probably from smallpox brought by the arriving Europeans, the empire split between two half-brothers, Huascar and Atahualpa, and they went to war. A brutal civil war that killed tens of thousands and left the empire exhausted and fractured at the exact moment a Spanish adventurer named Pizarro showed up with a couple hundred men and enormous ambitions. The most powerful empire in the Americas was gutted by a family feud right before it got conquered, and the winner, Atahualpa, was not a gracious one. After beating his half-brother, he set about exterminating Huascar's entire bloodline, reportedly forcing Huascar to watch his wives and children be killed before finishing him off, keeping it in the family one last time. Now, I do want to be fair to the Inca here, because there is a serious argument that their royal incest was not actually the self-destructive disaster it looks like. One anthropologist pointed out that the Sapa Inca had dozens, sometimes hundreds, of secondary wives and concubines beyond the sister Koya, so his gene pool overall was enormous and varied. The sister marriage was really about producing one specific, ritually perfect heir, while the actual reproduction was spread across a huge number of women. So the Inca may have gotten the political prestige of divine sibling marriage without paying the full genetic bill that a family like the Habsburgs would. Oh, and one more Inca detail that I cannot leave out, because it is one of the strangest customs in history. When a Sapa Inca died, they did not really treat him as gone. They mummified him and kept him, in a sense, alive. His mummy was dressed, kept in his palace, brought food and drink, consulted for advice, and paraded around at festivals on a litter. Each dead emperor's descendants formed a kind of corporation around his mummy, and that corporation kept owning all his palaces, land, and servants forever. So, the Inca capital of Cusco was full of preserved dead kings who technically still held all the best real estate in the empire, which means every new emperor inherited the throne but not the money, because Grandpa's mummy was still legally loaded and refused to give anything up. So each new ruler had to go out and conquer brand new territory just to fund his own reign. Historians think this bizarre dead king economy is part of what drove the Inca to expand so aggressively and so fast. The empire grew, in part, because the corpses would not share. Gods made by marriage. Hawaii deserves a spot, because the Hawaiian chiefs did not just tolerate sibling marriage, they used it as a machine for literally manufacturing gods. The Hawaiian nobility, the Ali, ran on a concept called mana, which was divine spiritual power, and rank was all about how much mana you had. And here is the disturbing part. You could concentrate mana through breeding, boiling it down tighter and tighter with each carefully arranged marriage. The most sacred union of all was called the pio, a marriage between a full brother and sister who were both already top-ranked chiefs. Their child was considered so saturated with mana that they were regarded as an actual living god. And these god-children came with terrifying rules called kapu. The highest ones were so sacred that tradition says they only came out at night and only spoke to ordinary people in the dark, because their divine power was considered too dangerous to unleash in daylight. There was a specific rule called the kapumo, the prostration taboo, which forced commoners to drop flat on their faces to the ground the instant one of these sacred chiefs came near. If even your shadow accidentally fell across one of them, that could be a death sentence. Imagine being so holy, purely because your parents were brother and sister, that your own shadow was a weapon and the sight of your face in daylight was forbidden. The best example is Keopuolani, who was born from a half-brother, half-sister union and ended up the single highest-ranking person in the entire island. So high, in fact, that she outranked her own husband, and her husband was Kamehameha the Great, the warrior king who conquered and united all of Hawaii. This is the wild part. Kamehameha, the most powerful man in Hawaiian history, had to remove his garment in the presence of his own wife to honor her sacred rank. The conqueror had to partly undress before the woman he married, because her inbred bloodline made her holier than him. And Keopuolani used that terrifying sacredness for one of the boldest moves in Hawaiian history. In 1819, after Kamehameha died, the old religion with all its brutal taboos was starting to feel outdated and suffocating. So Keopuolani, the holiest person alive, deliberately sat down and ate a meal with men, which was strictly forbidden under the eating taboo, because she was so sacred that nobody could punish her. And because if the holiest person in the islands broke the rule, and the gods did nothing, then maybe the rules were not real. That single meal helped collapse the entire ancient Kapu religion, right before the Christian missionaries arrived to fill the vacuum. Her divine, inbred rank was the crowbar she used to pry the old world open. Then comes the tragedy. Keopuolani's 2 children by Kamehameha were a son, Kauikeauli, who became King Kamehameha III, and a daughter, Nahianaina, full brother and sister, and the old Hawaiian chiefs desperately wanted them to marry each other, because a full sibling pio union between those two would produce the supreme god heir of all Hawaii, the most sacred child imaginable. The problem was timing. Christian missionaries had just arrived, and they were absolutely horrified. So these 2 young royals were trapped between 2 worlds, an ancient culture cheering them toward each other, and a new religion screaming that it was a sin. They loved each other, they lived as a couple for a while, and the church excommunicated Nahianina for it. She was eventually married off to another chief. But in 1836, she gave birth to a son, and Kamehameha III publicly declared that infant the supreme heir to the throne of Hawaii, embracing the ancient dream. The baby lived only a few hours. Nahianina herself died soon after, around 21 years old, worn down by the impossible position she had been born into. The last great attempt to breed a Hawaiian god ended in a grave. Bavaria's fairy tale madness. Back to Europe, and to the family that turned cousin marriage into a factory for eccentric, tragic, castle-building lunacy. The Wittelsbachs of Bavaria. The Wittelsbachs married their relatives for centuries, cousins mostly, cousins on top of cousins. And the result was a family famous for producing beautiful, brilliant, and deeply unstable people. The poster child is King Ludwig II, the so-called fairy tale king. You have absolutely seen his work even if you do not know his name, because he is the man who built Neuschwanstein, the impossibly gorgeous mountain castle that Disney basically traced for the Sleeping Beauty castle. Ludwig was a genius at building dream palaces and a disaster at being a king. From his teens, he showed signs of serious mental trouble. He became a total recluse, awake all night and asleep all day, inverting his entire life so he could avoid dealing with people. By the end, he was reportedly dining alone with imaginary guests, setting places at the table for long-dead historical figures, such as Louis XIV of France, and holding full conversations with people who had been dead for a century. He nearly bankrupted the royal treasury building one fantasy castle after another while ignoring the actual business of ruling a kingdom. In 1867, he got engaged to his cousin Sophie, dutifully continuing the family tradition, then abruptly called the whole thing off. Because commitment was not his strong suit either, he seemed to prefer his castles to actual humans, and honestly, given his relatives, who could blame him? But here is the truly unhinged part of the Wittelsbachs story. And it involves Ludwig's younger brother, Otto. Otto was declared insane in his late 20s and locked away, completely incapacitated, confined for the rest of his life. And then his brother Ludwig died under mysterious circumstances, found drowned in a lake days after being declared insane himself, and removed from power. So the crown passed to the next in line, which was Otto, the permanently institutionalized, certifiably insane brother. So for 27 years, Bavaria technically had a king, King Otto I, who reigned the entire time from inside an asylum, never governing, never appearing, just legally being the king, while completely detached from reality. A reigning monarch in a padded room, his uncle ran the actual government as regent. And the family instability did not stop there. Their cousin was the famous Empress Elizabeth of Austria, Sisi, whose own son, Crown Prince Rudolf, died in a murder-suicide with his young mistress at a hunting lodge, one of the most notorious scandals in European royal history. Now, in fairness, historians debate how much of the Wittelsbach madness was inbreeding, and how much was other factors, and nobody has a confirmed genetic diagnosis for Ludwig or Otto. But when one tightly intermarried family produces this many reclusive, delusional, tragic figures across a few generations, the pattern is hard to ignore. They built the most beautiful castles in the world, and could not build a stable mind to live in them. The Queen Who Screamed. Portugal gives us a queen whose descent into madness was so complete that people claimed you could hear her screaming through the palace walls. Maria I of Portugal did something the previous cases only flirted with. In 1760, she married her own uncle, Infante Pedro, the brother of her father, Uncle Niece. She was 25, he was 42, and he became King Pedro III as her husband. This was not a random choice. It was one link in a long chain of Braganza family intermarriage, made worse by the fact that the Portuguese royals also kept marrying into the Spanish Bourbons, who were themselves a heavily inbred mess. So Maria was inbreeding, stacked on top of inbreeding. For a while she actually ruled well and was respected. Then it all came apart. Her mind began to unravel in the 1780s. The first big public sign came in 1786, when she had to be carried away from a public event in a state of delirium. Then in the early 1790s she was hit by a wave of grief. Her heir, her husband, and her confessor all died in a short span, and she shattered completely. She descended into a full psychotic breakdown, tormented by religious terror, convinced she was damned, seeing horrifying visions. Modern doctors looking back think she most likely had bipolar disorder with psychosis, though some have suggested porphyria, the same illness often blamed for Mad King George of Britain. And here is the tell that points at the family tree. The madness was clustered. Two of Maria's three sisters also suffered from mental disorders. Her grandfather and an uncle had struggled too. This was not one unlucky queen. This was a genetic thread woven through a family that kept marrying itself, generation after generation, folding the same unstable ancestry back in on itself until it started expressing in sister after sister. When mental illness shows up in one royal, you can call it bad luck. When it shows up in the queen and two of her three sisters, in a family famous for marrying relatives, the pattern is doing the talking. The detail that sticks with me is the sound. Contemporary accounts describe her shrieking, echoing through the halls of the Queluz Palace, a constant, horrifying soundtrack of a queen in torment. They summoned the most famous doctor in Europe for royal madness, the very same physician who had treated Britain's King George, and even he could do nothing for her. She was declared incurably insane, and the business of government carried on without her while she remained queen in name only. Then, in 1807, Napoleon's armies came pouring into Portugal, and the entire royal court made the dramatic decision to abandon Europe entirely and flee across the Atlantic to their colony of Brazil, carrying their broken, screaming queen along with them on the ships. And that is where she finished her strange life, in Rio de Janeiro in 1816, still deranged, still tormented. She holds the odd distinction of being the only Portuguese monarch to reign and die in the Americas, a queen who started out capable and respected, undone by an illness that ran straight down a family tree, that kept doubling back on itself, spending her final decade lost somewhere deep inside her own mind, an ocean away from the throne she once held with a clear head. Above the law, now the tone shifts. Up to this point, most of these rulers at least pretended there were limits. Ancient Persia is where a king looked at the concept of limits and had it legally deleted. The Achaemenid Persians, the empire of Cyrus the Great and Xerxes, kept their marriages very close to home to keep the crown, the wealth, and the claim to the throne locked inside one narrow ruling family. Marry an outsider, and suddenly your father-in-law has leverage over the empire. Marry your sister, and there is nobody new at the table. According to the Greek historian Herodotus, King Cambyses II married two of his own sisters, and Herodotus makes a point of saying this shocked people because the Persians had never married their sisters before. Now, big honesty flag here. Herodotus was a Greek writing about Persia's enemies, and a lot of the nastiest stories about Cambyses come from sources hostile to him, so some modern historians think the sister marriage and the tales of his madness were at least partly propaganda invented to smear the enemy king as an unhinged madman. There is even a competing ancient account that names a wife of his but never calls her his sister, so take Cambyses with a grain of salt. But the case that is better documented, and genuinely jaw-dropping, is Artaxerxes II, who ruled in the 300s BC. This man fell in love with his own daughter, Atassa. Not a cousin, not a half-sister, his daughter. And he decided he was going to marry her. Now, even in a court used to close-kin marriage, this was a step that made people deeply uncomfortable. So Artaxerxes did what powerful men do when the rules are inconvenient. He got the rules changed. He summoned his royal judges and had them formally rule that the king of Persia was above the law and could marry whomever he wished. An entire legal system bent, on command, to license a father marrying his daughter. It is one of the earliest recorded times a ruler openly rewrote the law to permit his own incest. There is a detail that makes it even stranger. Some accounts say Artaxerxes was actually encouraged into the marriage by his own mother, the fearsome queen Parysatis, one of the great schemers of Persian history, who apparently saw a daughter-wife as a way to keep power tightly bound inside the immediate family. So this was not just one king's private obsession. It was a family strategy with mom's blessing. And he was not done. He later married a second daughter, Amestris, two daughters. According to the Greek writer Plutarch, Artaxerxes was so devoted to his daughter-wife Atassa that he stayed with her and continued to sleep with her even after she developed leprosy. Read that sentence again and appreciate the sheer, unsettling commitment to the arrangement. This was also a court where earlier kings had set the tone. Darius the Great married a daughter of Cyrus, keeping the founding bloodline close, and the pattern of marrying half-sisters, nieces, and cousins ran right through the dynasty. So, Persia moves us into genuinely darker territory. Not because of documented birth defects, the ancient sources simply do not record those kinds of details, but because of the sheer, casual boldness of it. When your daughter is also your wife by official royal decree, and your grandmother arranged it, you have very much left the shallow end of the pool, killing demons in bed. Here is the one that genuinely breaks people's brains, because it is the only case on this entire list where inbreeding was not a scandal, not a dirty secret, not even just tolerated. It was a holy sacrament, a top-tier act of religious worship. Welcome to Zoroastrian Persia and the practice called ex-wedo. In the Zoroastrian religion, which was the faith of the Persian Empire for over 1,000 years, there was a category of marriage called next-of-kin marriage, and it came in 3 flavors, all of which are going to make you sit up: father and daughter, brother and sister, and mother and son, and these were not looked down on. They were considered among the single most virtuous, spiritually powerful acts a believer could perform. I want to be clear, this is not me exaggerating an ancient text for laughs. The scriptures are astonishingly specific about it. The religious writings describe ex-wedo as a way to wash away sin, to purify the bloodline, and to fight cosmic evil. According to one major sacred text, a single act of next-of-kin marriage kills 1,000 demons and thousands of sorcerers and witches. And the second act kills twice as many, climbing higher with every encounter into a running spiritual scoreboard. It even sets a merit exchange rate, stating that maintaining one of these marriages for 3 years earns you spiritual credit equal to giving away the entire world. And the texts rank the 3 types by holiness. Mother-son was considered the most meritorious of all, then father-daughter, then brother-sister. They ranked them. Somebody sat down and put incest in tier order. Where did this come from? The creation myth itself. In their cosmology, the great god of light and wisdom created the world, and in some versions his own daughter, the spirit of the earth, was also his consort. And the very first human couple were a pair of siblings who mated to produce the entire human race. So the universe, in this worldview, literally began with next-of-kin unions. By marrying your own mother, daughter, or sibling, you were not committing a sin, you were reenacting the sacred act of creation, renewing the cosmos, purifying your lineage, and personally slamming the door on the demon of darkness who was constantly trying to corrupt the world. The whole thing was framed as a cosmic battle, and your incestuous marriage was a weapon in it. Refusing to do it, or neglecting it, was itself treated as sinful, a small victory handed to the forces of evil. Imagine the family pressure. Not marrying your sister was letting the demons win. We know Persian royals and nobles practiced it, and it shows up most clearly under the later Sassanid Empire, which ran from the 200s to the 600s AD. One Sassanid king married his cousin, another reportedly married his own sister. It was woven right into the elite and the priesthood. How far down into the ordinary population it really spread is genuinely debated by scholars, but at the top it was a live, respected institution, and the reactions from outsiders tell you everything. Once Islam swept in, and Christian communities lived under Persian rule, foreign observers wrote about the practice with open horror. A famous medieval Muslim scholar called it depraved, and flatly claimed it produced feeble-mindedness and birth defects. Christian clergy inside Persia wrote long, exhausted treatises trying to stamp it out among their congregations. One Armenian Christian writer sneered that the prophet of the religion must have invented the whole doctrine just to justify his own appetites. The practice slowly faded and was basically extinct by around 1,000 years ago, surviving only as a strange memory in later religious texts. But sit with the sheer strangeness of it. Every other ruler on this list either hid their inbreeding, excused it, or claimed it was necessary for the bloodline. This is the one culture that looked at marrying your own mother and said, "No, this is not a sin we tolerate, this is a virtue we reward. This is worship." Nobody else on this list can say their incest came with a demon body count and a promise of paradise. He married his daughters. Now we return to Egypt, the true homeland of royal inbreeding, and to the pharaoh who was a religious revolutionary, an artistic weirdo, and a man who married his own children. Akhenaten. First, the setup. Because Egypt had been marinating in this for ages, across the roughly 250 years of the 18th dynasty, pharaoh after pharaoh married a sister or a half-sister. Ahmose, Amenhotep, the Thutmose kings, one after another, sister wives all the way down. The logic was religious. The pharaoh was considered a living god, and Egyptian mythology was full of divine siblings who married each other, most famously Osiris and his sister wife Isis. So a pharaoh marrying his sister was not seen as gross, it was seen as godlike. A way of proving the royal family was on a completely different plane from ordinary mortals. It was the standard operating procedure for keeping the divine royal blood from ever mixing with common blood. And it meant 3 straight centuries of steadily accumulating inbreeding, all quietly building pressure toward one very strange, very doomed family. Akhenaten, who ruled around 1350 BC, is famous for one enormous thing. He tried to delete Egypt's entire religion. He threw out the traditional gods and declared that there was really only one worth worshipping, the sun disk called the Aten, and he built a brand new capital city in the middle of nowhere to do it. His great royal wife was the legendary beauty, Nefertiti, whose painted bust is one of the most famous faces from the ancient world. But the DNA tells us Akhenaten also fathered a child with his own full sister, a woman whose name we do not even know for certain, and that child would become the most famous pharaoh of all time. We will get to him. The part that turns your stomach is the daughters. Akhenaten had 6 daughters with Nefertiti, and the evidence, from inscriptions and titles and tomb art, indicates that after Nefertiti left the scene, Akhenaten elevated at least 1 and likely 2 of his own daughters to the role of wife. His eldest, Meritaten, and probably his 3rd daughter, the one who would later marry his sister-born son. He married his own children. Now, I have to flag the honest uncertainty here, because Akhenaten's reign was so hated by later pharaohs that they deliberately smashed and defaced his monuments, trying to erase him from history. So a lot of these family relationships are reconstructed from damaged inscriptions and are debated. Some scholars argue that elevating a daughter to great royal wife might have been a purely ceremonial title, not an actual sexual marriage. Fair enough. But the standard reading of the evidence is a lot darker, and it gets genuinely tragic. There was a daughter named Meketaten, his second, and she appears to have died around the age of just 10 to 12 years old. In the royal tomb, there are carved scenes showing the entire royal family gathered in grief around her body, and standing near that death scene is an image of an infant. The standard reading among historians, and I have to stress this is inferred from the tomb carvings and is debated, is that Meketaten died in childbirth, which means a child of around 10 to 12 died, delivering a baby that was very likely fathered by her own father. It is one of the darkest possible readings of any ancient monument, a little girl killed by the very system that was supposed to keep the bloodline sacred, and the whole rotten, glorious, doomed experiment was about to produce its most famous product. The boy king's bones. Everybody knows the golden mask, the dazzling treasure, the untouched tomb, the boy who became the most famous face of ancient Egypt. What most people do not know is that King Tutankhamun is arguably the single best documented victim of royal inbreeding in all of history. Because we did not have to guess about his family. We ran his DNA. In 2010, a team led by the Egyptian archaeologist Zahi Hawass published a study in a major medical journal that genetically tested 11 royal mummies to sort out Tut's family, and the results were damning. Tut's father was almost certainly the mummy identified as Akhenaten, and Tut's mother was another mummy, known as the Younger Lady, who turned out to be a full biological sister of his father, same parents. So King Tut, the Golden Boy, the face of Egypt, was the son of a brother and a sister. Not cousins, not half-siblings, full siblings. To appreciate how solid this is, understand what the study actually did. The team took 11 mummies, ran genetic fingerprinting on them, and cross-checked the results against detailed CT scans, essentially building a family tree out of DNA instead of guesswork. That is how they pinned down that the mummy in a particular tomb was Tut's father, and that the woman known only as the Younger Lady was both Tut's mother and that same man's full sister. I will be fair and note that some geneticists have pushed back, arguing that ancient degraded DNA plus heavy inbreeding can muddy the genetic markers and make relationships look closer or messier than they really are, and there have been calls to retest the whole family with newer methods. So, hold it with appropriate care. But it remains the most direct genetic evidence of royal inbreeding we have for anyone in the ancient world. And unlike Cleopatra, who somehow came out sharp and healthy, Tut's body paid the full price. The CT scans and DNA painted a picture of a genuinely sick young man. He had a club foot, his left foot was deformed and turned, and the bones in it were actually dying, a condition where the bone tissue rots from lack of blood supply. He had a partial cleft palate. He probably had a bit of a curved spine, and his DNA revealed that he was carrying malaria. In fact, the genetic traces of the malaria parasite were found in his body, some of the oldest proof of the disease ever discovered. Here is the detail that makes it click. Tut's tomb contained more than 130 walking sticks and canes. For a long time, that was read as clear proof that this frail young king literally could not stand or walk without support, that he hobbled through his short life, leaning on a stick. I will flag that some researchers now argue the canes might have been ceremonial symbols of power rather than medical aids. And honestly, some scientists have criticized the whole DNA study and want the family retested, so we should hold it a little loosely. But the picture of a sickly, limping boy fits the broken little body in the tomb. He died young, around 18 or 19 years old, probably from a nasty combination of a broken leg and malaria, hammering an already weakened body. There is even embalming resin found inside the leg wound, which tells us the injury happened shortly before death, not after. No solid proof of murder, despite all the conspiracy theories. Just a sick young man whose fragile, inbred body finally gave out. And then there is the saddest artifact of all. Tut married his half-sister, Akhenaten, keeping the pattern alive into yet another generation. And his tomb held two tiny mummified bodies, his two daughters, both stillborn, one lost early in the pregnancy, and one carried nearly to full term. I should note that a later scan cast some doubt on claims that the larger fetus had major deformities, so I am not going to overstate that part. But the core fact stands, and it is heartbreaking. Generations of keeping it strictly in the family had left the royal line unable to produce a single living heir, and so the most famous dynasty in Egyptian history simply ended with a teenage king buried beside his two dead infant daughters. The golden mask, the treasure, the fame, all of it is sitting on top of a very sad little story about a boy who could not walk right and could not have a healthy child, because his parents were brother and sister, the sibling lovers. If Egyptian pharaohs invented royal sibling marriage as a sacred tradition, the Ptolemies, the Greek family that ruled Egypt after Alexander the Great, took that tradition and industrialized it. They turned marrying your sister from an occasional custom into the family's default setting for nearly 300 years. Here is the funny bit. The Ptolemies were not even Egyptian, they were Macedonian Greeks, descendants of one of Alexander's generals, but when they took over Egypt, they decided to go full local and adopt the pharaonic sibling marriage custom. And then they somehow out-Egypted the Egyptians at it. It started with Ptolemy II, whose actual official nickname, Philadelphus, literally means sibling lover, because he married his full sister Arsinoe, and instead of hiding it, the court poets celebrated it, comparing the royal couple to the king and queen of the gods, who were also, conveniently, brother and sister. From there, it just kept folding in on itself. Brother married sister, who was the daughter of a brother and sister, who were the children of cousins. Remember that inbreeding coefficient from the intro, the one that hits 0.25 for the child of siblings? By a few generations in, one Ptolemy king already had a coefficient of roughly 0.27, higher than a single brother-sister pairing because his sibling parents were themselves the products of earlier inbreeding. The math was compounding the way interest compounds, except the thing accumulating was genetic risk. And there is a hilarious side effect of all this family folding. Because everyone kept marrying inside the clan and reusing the same handful of names, the dynasty became almost impossible to keep track of. There are so many Ptolemies and so many Cleopatras that historians literally have to number them just to tell them apart. And even then, for some individuals, we genuinely cannot be sure who their mother was, because she could have been any of several sisters, nieces, or cousins floating around the same tangled household. The family tree is less a tree and more a plate of spaghetti. Which brings us to the most famous Ptolemy of all, Cleopatra VII. The Cleopatra, and here is a genuinely mind-bending claim, which I have to wrap in caution. By some genealogical calculations, Cleopatra's inbreeding coefficient may have been somewhere around 45%, which would make her potentially one of the most inbred humans in recorded history, more inbred than even the champion we are building toward. But, and this is a real but, we do not actually know for certain who Cleopatra's mother was. If her mother was another close relative, the number rockets up. If her mother was an outsider, it drops. So the most inbred person ever is a plausible claim, not a proven fact. Cleopatra herself followed the family playbook to the letter. She co-ruled with and married her two younger brothers in turn, Ptolemy XIII and then Ptolemy XIV, both of whom were literally children, roughly 10 to 12 years old, when she married them. These were pure political formalities, obviously never real marriages in any meaningful sense, and she wound up at war with the first, who drowned in the Nile trying to flee her allies. And she very likely had the second quietly poisoned once she had a son by Julius Caesar to install as her heir instead. Her actual children came from Romans, from Caesar, and then Mark Antony, not from her boy-brother husbands. And here is the beautiful irony that makes Cleopatra the great counterexample of this entire topic. Despite possibly being the single most inbred royal in recorded history, she was, by every ancient account, brilliant, healthy, energetic, politically ruthless, and dazzlingly educated. She was reportedly fluent in as many as 9 languages, and was said to be the first ruler of her entire Greek dynasty to actually bother learning the Egyptian language of the people she ruled. No monster jaw, no limp, no drooling, no madness. She is the one who somehow rolled the loaded genetic dice and came up a winner, which is exactly why scientists find her so fascinating and so frustrating. Inbreeding raises the odds of disaster, but it does not guarantee it, and Cleopatra is the living proof. And the weirdest part of the entire Ptolemy story is that it did not stay locked inside the palace. Sibling marriage became so normalized in Egyptian society that we have hard paperwork proving ordinary people copied it. Census and tax records written on papyrus, surviving from the era when Rome ruled Egypt, show regular citizens, not royals, marrying their own full brothers and sisters at genuinely astonishing rates. In the countryside it was common, and in one city the documents show that something around a third, by some counts closer to 37%, of all recorded marriages were between full siblings. These were real marriage contracts, with dowries and children, brother and sister listed as husband and wife. And here is the part that keeps historians up at night. Those records do not show any obvious spike in dead babies or infertility among these sibling couples, which is a genuinely puzzling data point that scholars still argue about. So, the royals made incest fashionable, and the commoners, for a few centuries at least, enthusiastically followed the trend. Nowhere else in recorded history do we have this much documentary proof of an entire ordinary population marrying inside the immediate family. Potbelly's birthday gift. We need to slow down for one specific Ptolemy, because he is the perfect storm of inbreeding, grotesque behavior, and the single most disturbing gift-giving story in ancient history. Meet Ptolemy VIII, better known by his nickname, Physcon, which politely translates to potbelly, and less politely to fatty or sausage. He earned the name. Ancient sources describe him as enormously, spectacularly obese, so heavy that he had to be carried everywhere in a litter because walking any real distance was beyond him. When a Roman delegation led by a famous general visited Egypt around 139 BC, the story goes that the Roman ambassador had to physically support the wheezing king as he waddled to greet them, and to make it worse, Physcon apparently showed up wearing a thin, see-through gown, giving the visiting Romans a full and unwanted view of the royal physique. The Romans, who prized discipline and self-control, were absolutely disgusted and mocked him behind his back, treating the encounter as proof of how soft and rotten the Eastern monarchies had become. Now the family situation, which is a not even by Ptolemy standards. Physcon married his sister, Cleopatra II, who had previously been married to their brother. Fine, standard Ptolemy stuff. But then, while still married to his sister, he also married her daughter, Cleopatra III, which meant the younger Cleopatra was simultaneously his niece and his stepdaughter and his wife. And it meant his sister was now his wife and his mother-in-law at the same time. He married a woman, and then also married that woman's daughter without divorcing the first. The family tree needs a warning label. But the reason Physcon earns his infamy is not the marriages. It is what he did during his vicious feud with his sister wife Cleopatra II. He had their own son, a boy named Ptolemy Memphites, who was around 12 years old, killed. And then, according to the ancient historians, he had the boy dismembered, the body cut apart, and he had the head, hands, and feet packed into a box. And he had that box delivered to Cleopatra II, the boy's mother, timed, the sources say, to arrive on her birthday, reportedly right in the middle of a celebration. She opened her birthday present and found the mutilated remains of her son. Now, historians treat the birthday flourish with some caution. It may be dramatized for horror by the Roman writers who recorded it, but the core, that he murdered and dismembered their son and sent the pieces to his mother, is broadly accepted. And it was not even his only atrocity. When he seized the city of Alexandria, he turned his soldiers loose to massacre the population, so thoroughly that one ancient source says he was left nearly alone with his troops in the emptied city. And when a group of young men took shelter in a gymnasium, one of the great cultural institutions of the Greek world, he had the entire building burned down with them still inside it. So Physcon is where the inbreeding and the cruelty fuse into something genuinely monstrous, and it is worth asking whether they are connected. It is impossible to prove the incest damaged his mind. Plenty of non-inbred rulers have been monsters, but there is something fitting about the most tangled family tree in the ancient world, producing a bloated, universally hated king, married to his sister and her daughter at the same time, mailing dismembered children as birthday gifts. The people of Alexandria took his royal title, which meant the benefactor, and mockingly rewrote it to mean the malefactor, the evildoer. When your own subjects rename you to the exact opposite of your title, you have made an impression. I want dumplings. Now we begin the final ascent, and it runs through the most infamous inbreeding family in all of European history, the Habsburgs. And before we reach their final, tragic masterpiece, we need to meet a Habsburg from the other branch, the Austrian side. A gentle, well-meaning man who was catastrophically unequipped to run an empire. Emperor Ferdinand, the First of Austria. Ferdinand's parents were double first cousins, meaning they were not just cousins, they were cousins twice over, related through multiple lines at once, because the Austrian Habsburgs, like their Spanish relatives, had been marrying inside the family for generations. And Ferdinand paid for it. He was born in 1793, with a serious pile of medical conditions widely blamed on that genetic closeness. He suffered from severe epilepsy, and I do not mean the occasional seizure. Sources describe him having as many as 20 seizures a day. 20. It is almost impossible to run a household like that, let alone one of the great empires of Europe. He also had hydrocephalus, fluid on the brain, which left his head noticeably enlarged and out of proportion with his small, frail body. He had neurological problems and a speech impediment, and struggled to string together the kind of coherent commands an emperor is supposed to give. Here is the thing though, and I want to be fair to Ferdinand, because he is genuinely likable. He was not stupid. This is the mistake people make about as one the stately endeavor. Despite everything, he kept a clear, coherent personal diary. He reportedly had a decent wit, and he could play the piano. His mind worked. His body and his nervous system just betrayed him constantly, day after day. He could think. He just could not rule. So the actual governing was handed off to a council of powerful ministers, most famously the arch-conservative Metternich, while Ferdinand sat on the throne as a kindly figurehead. When the revolutions of 1848 swept across Europe and shook every throne, Ferdinand was gently persuaded to abdicate in favor of his young nephew, Franz Joseph, who would go on to rule for an astonishing 68 years. Ferdinand, freed from a job he never should have had, reportedly lived out his retirement quite happily, and by several accounts managed his own affairs at his castle in Prague, better than he had ever managed an empire. And he gave history one of its most endearingly absurd royal quotes. The story goes that Ferdinand wanted his favorite dish, apricot dumplings, and was told he could not have them because apricots were out of season. And the Emperor of Austria, ruler of millions, responded with the full weight of his imperial authority by declaring, "I am the emperor, and I want dumplings." That line has followed him for almost 200 years, the perfect summary of a kind, harmless man who had a throne he never should have been handed. His nickname was Ferdinand the Benign, and the sharp-tongued people of Vienna twisted it into a pun that roughly meant Ferdinand the Finished. One more grim detail, the poor man reportedly suffered 5 seizures on his wedding night while trying to consummate his marriage. The genes were relentless. 2 centuries of folding. Ferdinand was the Austrian branch. But the real horror story, the reason the word Habsburg is basically a synonym for inbreeding, is the Spanish branch. And to understand their grand finale, you have to understand the 200-year machine that built him. This is where we stop talking about single incestuous marriages and start talking about a family tree that folded in on itself so many times it stopped making sense. The Spanish Habsburgs had a strategy. They ran one of the largest empires on earth, holdings scattered across Europe and the Americas, and they were determined to keep it all in the family by marrying it all in the family. So over roughly 200 years, they married cousins to cousins, and crucially, they did uncle-niece marriages, where a man marries his own brother's or sister's daughter. When scientists later reconstructed the family tree, They found that of the 11 principal marriages in the line over about 2 centuries, 9 of them were between close blood relatives. 9 out of 11. That included multiple uncle-niece marriages and a marriage between double first cousins. To see how fast it accelerated, look at the numbers the scientists calculated for the inbreeding coefficient across the line. The founder of the Spanish branch had a coefficient of about 0.025, basically normal, barely related parents. But as the generations of intermarriage stacked up, the number climbed and climbed, until the average across the Spanish Habsburg kings sat around 0.13, and the final king hit a staggering 0.25 and beyond. In other words, over about 2 centuries, the family managed to increase its inbreeding roughly tenfold, breeding itself from a normal royal house into a genetic cul-de-sac. The problem with doing this over and over is that the same small set of ancestors keeps showing up in the family tree in more and more places. Instead of having 16 different great-great-grandparents, you might have the same handful of people occupying dozens of the slots. The tree stops branching outward and starts collapsing inward. And every generation the babies come out more and more genetically identical to their own parents, which is exactly the condition that lets rare, dangerous recessive genes pair up and switch on. And the cost was written in dead children. When researchers looked at the survival rates of Spanish Habsburg babies, they found something genuinely horrifying. Out of 34 children born to these kings over about 130 years, nearly 30% died before their first birthday, and fully half died before the age of 10. Let that sink in. These were the richest, best-fed, best-doctored children on the continent, with every resource imaginable. And they died at a higher rate than the peasant babies in ordinary Spanish villages. Wealth is supposed to buy survival, and their bloodline was so damaged it did the opposite. The scientists even had a term for it: inbreeding depression, the measurable drop in health and survival that comes from concentrated inbreeding. This is also the family that gave us the most famous physical mark of inbreeding in history, the Habsburg jaw. It was a heavy, protruding lower jaw, an underbite so pronounced that it deformed the whole lower face, and it usually came paired with a droopy, oversized lower lip and a big nose, thanks to an undersized upper jaw that could not keep up. You can literally track it through 200 years of royal portraits, and the wild thing is, the Habsburgs did not hide it. They commissioned honest portraits, jaw and all, because to them that face was proof of their exclusive, unmixed royal blood. In 2019, a team of researchers had 10 maxillofacial surgeons study 66 Habsburg portraits, scoring the severity of the jaw in each one, then compared it against how inbred each family member was. And the result was clear: the more inbred the individual, the worse the jaw. The single most pronounced case of the protruding lower jaw belonged to Philip IV, who, remember his name, was the father of our grand finale. The face itself had become a family signature, written directly in the DNA and painted onto the walls of palaces. And all of it, the dead babies, the collapsing tree, the monster jaw, 2 full centuries of a family determinedly marrying itself, all of it funneled down into one final, doomed, almost unbelievable human being, the bewitched. And so we arrive at the champion, the final boss, the single most inbred ruler in the recorded history of the world, and the man whose broken body ended a dynasty and started a continental war just by dying. King Charles II of Spain, whom they called El Hechizado, the bewitched, because people genuinely believed no natural person could be that unwell, so he must have been cursed by witchcraft. Let us start with the number, because it is the number that ends all arguments. Scientists calculated Charles II's inbreeding coefficient, that measure of how related his parents were, at 0.254. Here is why that is insane. The coefficient you would get from a child of a full brother and sister, or a parent and their own child, is 0.25. Charles's number was higher than that. He was, genetically, more inbred than if his parents had simply been siblings, because 200 years of stacked incest had packed so much repeated ancestry into him. His own mother was his father's niece. His grandmother was also his aunt. The tree was not a tree anymore, and his body was a full catalog of the results, a checklist of nearly everything that can go wrong. As a small child, Charles could not walk at all. His legs simply would not support his weight, and he was kept in braces while the court fretted. He could barely speak until he was much older, partly because his tongue was so large and his jaw so misaligned that forming words was a struggle. He was so weak and sickly as an infant that he was breastfed by a rotating cast of 14 different wet nurses. His Habsburg jaw, inherited in its most extreme form from his father Philip IV, was so severe that his upper and lower rows of teeth could not actually meet each other. Sit with what that means for a second. He physically could not chew his own food. He had to swallow things nearly whole, which wrecked his digestion and left him with relentless stomach problems, chronic vomiting, and a life of being constantly, miserably sick. On top of that, he drooled, he suffered seizures, his hair fell out, and by his early 30s, observers said he already looked frail and elderly. decades ahead of schedule. One famous account summed him up as short, lame, epileptic, senile, and completely bald before he was 35, always seeming to be on the very edge of death, yet stubbornly, almost miraculously, refusing to actually die for decades. He became king at just 3 years old, far too sick and too young to actually govern, so his mother ruled as regent, while the child king was coddled, carried, and kept alive by a nervous court that half expected him to die at any moment. He was so fragile and so pampered that he was not even properly toilet-trained or educated on any normal schedule. The whole apparatus of the Spanish Empire, one of the largest on earth, was effectively waiting around for its king to be physically capable of ruling it, and that day never really arrived. And critically, he could not produce an heir. He married twice, first to a French princess and then to a German one, and both marriages were completely childless. His body simply could not do it. Scientists who have studied his symptoms now think he was hit with not one but two separate rare genetic disorders at the very same time. A genetic double disaster that really only extreme inbreeding could deliver, one condition wrecking his hormones and growth and fertility, the other attacking his kidneys and muscles. Two different recessive genetic diseases lining up in one person, which is exactly the kind of grim lottery you win when your parents share as much DNA as Charles's did. People genuinely believed he was the victim of witchcraft, that some curse or possession explained a king this broken, and at one point he was actually subjected to exorcisms to try to drive out whatever demon was thought to be destroying him. That is how far beyond normal his condition seemed to the people around him. The real culprit was not a witch. It was a family tree that had been folded in half so many times it barely functioned. Now, for the autopsy, and I have to be honest with you here, because this is exactly where history and legend blur together. The story that always gets repeated is a spectacularly gruesome one. It claims that when the physicians opened up Charles, the second after his death, they found a body that did not contain a single drop of blood, a heart the size of a peppercorn, corroded and blackened lungs, rotten intestines, a single shriveled black testicle, and a head full of water. It is an unforgettable, horrifying image. But you deserve to know the truth about it. This exact vivid wording traces back to a modern popular history book, and is always reported secondhand, never from a verified original document. So the bloodless body and the peppercorn heart are almost certainly rhetorical exaggeration, the kind of grim poetry that gets repeated because it sounds perfect. What is genuinely well supported by the evidence is the water on the brain and the single atrophied testicle. So the reality was still grim, just maybe not quite as theatrically, cartoonishly grim as the famous version makes it sound. I would rather tell you the honest version than the viral one. He died on the 1st of November, 1700, at just 38 years old, worn out and broken. And because he left no child, the entire Spanish Habsburg line, the family that had ruled a global empire spanning Europe and the Americas, and had married itself into oblivion doing it, simply died with him. Here is the part that turns a sad medical story into a world historical event. A dying, childless king still controls who gets his throne. On his deathbed, Charles willed the entire Spanish Empire to a French prince, a grandson of the mighty French King Louis XIV. And the rest of Europe took one look at the idea of France and Spain potentially uniting under one family and said, absolutely not. The result was the War of the Spanish Succession, a colossal conflict that dragged in Britain, the Dutch, Austria, and most of the continent, and killed hundreds of thousands of people over more than a decade. Let that fully land. A continent-spanning war, hundreds of thousands dead, the map of Europe redrawn, all of it set in motion, because 200 years of a family stubbornly marrying itself had finally produced a king so genetically broken he could not father a single child. That is the ultimate price of keeping it in the family. Not a funny jaw, not a limp, not a drooling chin. An entire dynasty erasing itself from existence and setting the world on fire on the way out the door. So there is your ranking, from Victoria's quiet little cousin marriage, all the way down to the bewitched himself. The whole thing is one long, escalating lesson that the fastest way to destroy a precious royal bloodline was to protect it far too well. They were all so terrified of letting in outside blood that they strangled their own family trees, and the crowns, the empires, the divine bloodlines they were guarding so jealously all withered anyway. So the next time a family reunion feels a little too close for comfort, take some comfort in this. At least you can walk into the room in daylight. At least nobody had to legally rule you above the law. And at least, unlike poor Charles II,